So before we get started with our third panel, we have a special guest to give a few opening remarks and set it up for our next discussion. Since being sworn in as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Julius Januszkowski, now you're going to, okay, I was crossing my fingers, has focused the agency on unleashing the opportunities of wired and wireless broadband. He has successfully pursued policies to promote investment and job creation, drive innovation, foster competition, and empower consumers. During his tenure, the FCC developed and is implementing the National Broadband Plan, an ambitious strategy to harness the opportunities of high-speed internet, promote U.S. global competitiveness, and bring the benefits of the 21st century communications to all Americans. The Commission adopted the landmark Connect America Fund, replacing legacy programs with new market-driven, incentive-based policies to achieve universal broadband, both wired and wireless. The Commission is also working to harness a new nationwide mobile emergency alerting system, which would include an interoperable nationwide mobile broadband network for first responders. Thank you for taking the time to come and give us a few remarks today. Over to Chairman of the FCC.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and then much more important, organizing this conference and bringing together such a distinguished group of people from multiple parts of the ecosystem to focus on scoping the problem and solving it. I'm happy to be here with Admiral Jamie Barnett, who has run our Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for the last 3 years and has been instrumental in the things I'm going to talk about in these brief remarks, ahead of what I know will be a terrific panel. I think, I don't know if Ambassador McConnell is here, but I should apologize publicly for being late yesterday. I did have a good reason, and we were able to announce it today. And it's an initiative that's, it's not unrelated to what we're talking about at this conference, but we worked on some solutions to the problem of increasing smartphone theft. And if you don't care about this in your cyber hats, you'll care about it in your individual hats. The increasing rate of stolen smartphones is very scary. In Washington, D.C., it's gone from about 8% of crimes 5 years ago to over 40%. Similar statistics in New York and Philadelphia. And it makes sense, right? Smartphones are mini computers. They have tremendous value on the black market. And if someone can steal them, resell them, and they can be used on other networks, of course they have value, and a rational thief will make use of that. So we announced today with the wireless industry that we're moving forward in the United States with a database to block stolen cell phones on any network in the U.S. I have to say the U.S. wasn't first in this. The GSMA in Europe, the Mobile Association in Europe, has done this, and it's actually been very effective, particularly in the UK. But we announced today with the wireless industry that we're doing this in the US. And so over the coming months, we're enabling consumers and carriers to call stolen cell phones to be rendered as worthless as an empty wallet. We're also the wireless carriers are going to enable automatic prompts on smartphones to enter passwords and to be able to lock them. And we're launching an educational campaign so that consumers are aware of the applications that exist that allow them to remotely locate, lock, and wipe their devices. Not unrelated to cybersecurity, but let me talk about cybersecurity from the FCC's perspective. Now, tackling the challenges of internet security is, of course, extremely important, as everyone here agrees. It's so important not just because of the threats, and not just because the threats are so big, but because the benefits and opportunities of the internet are so big. So broadband internet over wired and wireless networks has transformed our economy and society, opening up a new world of opportunity. $8 trillion now are exchanged over these wired and wireless networks each year, growing. The internet is driving productivity gains, economic growth, job creation. If you shut down the internet, already today, you'd shut down our economy. That's both the good news and the bad news, which is often the case with new technologies. They present vast new opportunities and new dangers. And the challenge is to tackle the dangers without undermining the opportunities. It's not an easy challenge. One of the first steps, I think, and I know many of you have been working on this, is to break down the challenge into categories that allow for discussion and problem solving. One division of the threats is into 3 categories of networks. It's not the only way to look at it, but we found it instructive. The first is government-owned networks. The second is the networks that sustain vertical industries like financial services and our energy grid. And the third is commercial networks, wired and wireless, which are what most Americans are using every day to send emails, pay bills, shop online. Commercial networks are also increasingly integrated with the second category, vertical networks of critical infrastructure. And in more and more ways, we're seeing commercial networks integrated with the first, government-owned and operated networks. At the FCC, we've been focused on the third category, commercial networks, which I understand is a subject for the panel that will follow me. And as the nation's expert agency on communications, networks, and technology, the FCC has always had as a fundamental part of our mission the security and reliability of commercial communications networks. In developing strategies and initiatives that tackle the cyber threats while preserving the opportunities, we've sought to identify key values that have fueled the internet's growth and success. That means strategies that preserve internet freedom and the open architecture of the internet. It means preserving privacy. It means acknowledging that what some see as a fundamental divide between privacy and security is a false choice, that in fact they're complementary and that we need to do both. A third key component for problem solving in this area is the multi-stakeholder model, symbolized in part by this conference. Solutions to cyber threats require the many stakeholders of the internet community to work together and develop practical solutions to secure our networks. The goal is solutions, not regulation, and it's important to keep focused on the goal. The history of the internet tells us that the multi-stakeholder model can produce real solutions to a vast array of challenges. With that in mind, let me describe 2 FCC cybersecurity initiatives. First, small businesses and cybersecurity. Last year, working with the Small Business Administration, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Urban League, many private technology companies, we developed and released a cybersecurity tip sheet for small businesses, describing a number of common sense steps small businesses can take to increase their security. Password protecting your Wi-Fi is one obvious example. Working with our partners, the FCC also released a tool, an easy-to-use tool, we call it a Small Biz Cyber Planner, to help small businesses develop a customized cyber plan. And along with our partners inside and outside government, we're working to expand the distribution of this tool and the tips. Now, yes, this is low-hanging fruit. But it's important, and that's one of the points that I wanted to make, which is that there is a lot of low-hanging fruit to tackle in addressing cyber threats. And we can't let the larger and more complex challenges keep us from making practical progress on low-hanging fruit. The second area of FCC activity, ISPs and cybersecurity. In March of last year, I tasked the FCC's Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, we call it CSRIC, with making recommendations to help address 3 concrete challenges that our work and the work of others had identified in the cybersecurity area: botnets, domain name fraud, and internet route hijacking, or secure BGP. This was a deliberate choice on how to proceed. One, deploying this advisory group for this purpose. It had been an advisory group that had been up and running for a number of years and had been a proven vehicle for bringing together different players from the private sector, different players from government agency, and developing recommendations and solutions to problems. And the second thing is I gave them 3 concrete areas in which we wanted progress and solutions. I encourage this approach to others. I fear that a boil the ocean approach is less likely to lead to material real-world progress, and that sometimes in this area it's what we naturally fall back on. Now, as I mentioned, CISRIC, our advisory council, is made up of industry leaders, academics, engineers, federal partners. Its membership includes companies working every day to build and expand internet infrastructure and services, from Verizon and Comcast to Amazon and PayPal. It includes experts like internet pioneers Steve Crocker and Michael O'Riordan. I saw Melissa Hathaway here earlier, and she was extremely helpful in this process. I don't remember if Melissa was a member of CISRIC. An advisor. And it includes federal experts from multiple agencies, as well as representatives from state and local public safety entities. We formed and tasked CISRIC in March of 2011, and last month, CISRIC issued a series of smart, practical recommendations on the 3 issues with which they were tasked to address. Solutions consistent with the principles I outlined earlier in these remarks. On botnets, CISRIC developed a voluntary U.S. anti-bot code of conduct to reduce the threat of bots in residential broadband networks. The code includes concrete steps to better detect bots in customer computers, to notify consumers when their computers had been infected, to educate consumers, and to remediate. On domain name fraud, CISRIC endorsed new steps toward implementing DNSSEC, as you're all aware. In particular, CISRIC recommended that ISPs use DNSSEC to give their customers the ability to validate the services they use on the internet. On internet route hijacking, secure BGP, the CISRIC report called on network operators to develop and adopt new technical standards that will secure internet routing. Standards would establish an authoritative registry that will enable ISPs to validate the authenticity of routing information, securing the foundation of trust between networks, which has been so essential to the internet's success. Now, CISRIC laid out a concrete plan for action in those 3 key areas, but we were able to accomplish more than that. In conjunction with the issuance of the CISRIC report, ISPs that serve roughly 80% of our country's internet users committed to implementing the recommendations. And today I'm pleased to announce that 2 more major broadband providers, Cablevision and Charter, have signed on, committing to implementing the recommendations as well, bringing the share of American broadband consumers who will have enhanced online security to about 90%. Now, of course, technology continues to change, consumer behaviors continue to evolve, new cyber threats will develop. The bad guys won't stop innovating, and that means the good guys can't stop innovating either. I'm hopeful that the path and process we worked through can be an effective model more broadly, bringing together multiple stakeholders outside and inside government, charging them with solving concrete problems, and honoring core values we want to preserve. Now, I hope that this panel might address some questions that we are asking ourselves. How can we increase the chances now of success of the botnet, DNSSEC, and internet route hijacking initiatives? How do we measure performance? What are the metrics? What new threats are emerging as networks evolve and as mobile broadband becomes more ubiquitous? In what other areas can the FCC be part of the solution? I look forward to hearing the panel's thoughts on these and other topics. Working together, I'm confident that we can make a real difference in increasing the security of the internet and harnessing its enormous opportunities. We have to. Thank you.
Short and sweet. So for our third panel of the day, we're going to hear from a variety of perspectives focused on the commercial aspects of cybersecurity. I want to introduce the moderator, chair for the panel, Mr. Eddie Schwartz. Eddie is Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for RSA and has 25 years of experience in the information security field. He has advised a number of early-stage security companies and has served on the Executive Committee for the Banking Information Technology Secretariat. Mr. Schwartz has a BIS in Information Security Management and an MS in Information Technology Management from George Mason University School of Management. Eddie, thank you very much for taking the lead on this panel, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. All right, everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to our panel. I'd like to start out by introducing my esteemed panelists, who are nicely in the order of speaking as well. First of all, Mr. Scott Borg, who is the Director and Chief Economist of the U.S. Cyber Consequences Unit. Mr. Robert Dix, but you can call him Bob. He's the Vice President of Government Affairs and Critical Infrastructure Protection for Juniper. Third is Mr. Rick Howard. He is the General Manager of the iDefense Business Unit at VeriSign Network Intelligence and Availability. Dr. Robert Ganay-Hercock, Chief Researcher, Security Futures Practice, British Telecom Innovate. And finally, Rear Admiral, retired, Jamie Barnett, Chief Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau of the FCC. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here. I'm going to start out by making a few remarks to set the stage, and then each panelist will have a few minutes to talk about their perspectives on the issues that are of interest to them. After they do their presentations, other panelists may have some comments or choice words about some of the comments of the other panelists. I would encourage you during that time to think about any questions you may have, because after these initial sessions, we're going to open it up for discussion among everyone in the room. So please, I encourage you to start thinking about anything that you've heard that you want to expand on, challenge, ask questions, take an opposing viewpoint or agreement, what have you. So our panel is on commercial perspectives in cybersecurity. And I think some of the things to think about here are, first of all, where we are today. Organizations, whether you're in the government, commercial sector, we've all spent billions of dollars over the last few decades on cybersecurity. You could think about technology that we've invested in, people that we've trained, processes that we've created, things that we've done. And if you look around, though, today, sometimes it appears that it's a bleak picture, whether it's issues related to nation-sponsored attacks, criminal groups, the latest anonymous hacks, what have you. It feels like we're failing in some way. We thought we were okay, but yeah, I guess we're not. So what's really going on here? For a long time, most of us that have been in this business have been trained in this notion of defense in depth. And I think many people took the defense aspect of that term a little bit too seriously. The defense seemed to come out as this notion of sort of pre-breach tooling, if you will. And so let's do everything we can to keep the bad guy out. Let's develop these complex processes, complex technologies, and throw all the investment at everything we can to stop bad things from happening. And we as commercial vendors of technologies and as builders of these processes and as trainers of your security people have certainly contributed to that as well in terms of encouraging you to do things and to invest in all of these things that are going to prevent bad things from happening. But we know, again, that this has been marginally effective related to advanced threats specifically. If we were to rethink defense in depth for today, there are a lot of things that, as many of you that have been breached or know organizations that have been breached. I joined RSA right after our big breach last year. The new aspect is sort of, what do you do post-breach in an organization? So how do we start thinking about what is the right balance between things that are designed to prevent bad things from happening, and how do we get visibility into the inevitable compromise that's going to be happening to us? How do we take all of these data that we have within our organization and encourage other organizations, whether it's the government, commercial entities such as some of the players that you see here today, to share that information? Once we have it, what do we do with it? What does big data mean in this context? And what do you do with all that once you start to get it? What do we do about some of the competing interests that are out there? When we think about data sharing and we have law enforcement, intelligence, other priorities that are out there, and how do we develop a policy framework that's appropriate? So a lot of questions on the table, and I know that our panelists are eager to talk about it. So what I'm going to do is start off by turning over the floor to Scott Borg, who is going to talk a little bit about his perspective on some of the commercial aspects of this problem.
This has been a very impressive gathering with a lot of very important people, and I'm impressed, really genuinely impressed by the assemblage of people here. I wanted to say that right away because I wanted to tell you about a very strange image that keeps coming to my mind as I've been listening to these discussions and comments, both today and yesterday evening. I have the feeling, I've been having the feeling, that I've been listening to the tail of the dog talking about its ideas for wagging the dog. Now, if you're the tail of the dog and you want to wag the dog, that could be a very commendable ambition. In this case, I think it is. But there are at least three things you should be aware of. First of all, you should be aware that you're the tail of the dog, not the dog's nose or the dog's head or the dog itself. And I'll explain that a little bit. Second, you should be thinking about the dog and what the dog is doing, what's going on here. And third, you should be thinking about where the dog is going, where the dog is headed next. If you want to change the behavior of the dog, if you want to redirect it, you should be thinking about where it's galloping off to right now. Now, the dog in this case is global business activity. It's the global economy. It's all of those businesses out there that are creating value. The thing that's directing the dog, the thing that determines where the dog is going, are the business opportunities in front of the dog, the business opportunities that the dog is off to seize. And these are business opportunities not just for the general creators of value that we all admire, but also for potential cyber attackers. The government agencies and departments, the legal institutions, all of the different groups that are very well represented here by very articulate spokespeople are so small compared to the global economy. They're so small compared to the dog itself that it is really important for them, if they want to shape the behavior of that dog, to get a sense of proportion. If you're in Washington, which is very much a company town, you're associated with the US government, you feel like a big dog. You feel like you yourself are the big dog. If you're in Silicon Valley, if you're out there in the private sector and you're looking at the federal government and in the Defense Department, it doesn't look so big. The whole federal government and the whole Defense Department is maybe 5% of your market if you're a global IT company. The activity of these businesses have been responsible for all of the deployment of information systems that the government and the Defense Department and everybody else uses. The economics of this has been responsible for where all the vulnerabilities are and what vulnerabilities are out there. The big thing that's shaping this landscape and changing the way it's going to look in the future are the seizing of these business opportunities. It's not the new technology internal to security. It's not any of the people that are speaking at this event that are shaping this. The landscape is being shaped by, as we move on, what can we do to create more value? We've had references, as we've been talking, to smartphones, to mobile devices, to all kinds of things that have come along that weren't here 3-4 years ago. In 2-3 years from now, we will have a whole nother set of things coming along with a whole new set of concerns. And they won't have been things that we shaped or created, those of us in this room. They'll be things that the developing world business has shaped. I'll mention just 3 things that will be shaping things, that have been shaping things already, and will even more in the years to come, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. If you take a tour of our economy, our industries, you can find lots of places where there are facilities that are not being used very much of the time, or to a very large extent. It's particularly conspicuous on the internet. We have a huge amount of capacity developed by companies like, say, Amazon, to deal with the peak shopping days before Christmas. And most of the rest of the year, that capacity is not being utilized. We've recently discovered that via cloud computing, Amazon can do everybody else's computing with that unused capacity the rest of the year. We have electrical generation stations that are built to cope with peak demand in afternoons of really hot days. And the rest of the time, most of that capacity is not being utilized. So we're now using dynamic pricing to start shifting the utilization of that capacity from the peak times to the trough times, to the nights, and other times when it's not being used. They're applying the same strategy now actually to parking in San Francisco, dynamic pricing to utilize that better, and so on. We're doing this throughout our economy. All of the cases where we're doing this, it is being made possible by new information technology, and everywhere we're deploying that technology, we're creating new vulnerabilities. And a lot of the deployment of these new technologies, a lot of the seizing of these business opportunities is already being held back by security concerns. It's the main thing that's been holding back cloud computing. So security technology here is an enabler of value creation. It plays a role in the bigger picture, in the picture of where that big dog is going. And it's an important role, but it needs to be seen in that context. 2 other examples before I sit down here. There are eight that my colleagues and I have been able to identify, and I'm just picking 3 to give you the flavor. Mobile information support means not being able to access information from wherever you are. It means pushing the information out to any employee to make that employee look like a genius, to give that employee the answers that that employee needs, the guidance they need, whether they're a maintenance person, whether they're a retail person, whether they're a medical person, whatever they are. Again, this is something that is producing huge deployment of new information technology. It's creating enormous vulnerabilities. It is being slowed down already by security concerns. It is one of the things shaping the landscape of security now and for quite a few years to come. Third one, information-rich markets. Traditional markets, the kind you learned about if you ever took Econ 101, commodity markets in effect, Adam Smith markets, from an information standpoint are very crude. Markets match customers with suppliers. Traditional markets match customers with suppliers using only 3 variables: type of product, quantity, and price. So once you've specified type of product, you're only using quantity and price. That's why supply and demand curves of the kind you've seen work. That's not how we match customers and suppliers anymore in the modern economy. We do multivariable matching. We do multivariable matching, sometimes it's automated. We do it all the time by just supplying customers with huge amount more information about their suppliers, and vice versa. We build up profiles of suppliers and profiles of customers. We do better and better matching utilizing these. This is one of the biggest creators of value already and will continue to be for the years to come. This is an enormously powerful tool. The profits of Google, of Facebook, of companies like that are just a tiny sliver of the new value being created by this. It's not about targeted advertising. If it were about targeted advertising, we wouldn't be able to explain how much money these companies are already making. It's about better matches between customers and suppliers. Once again, this is creating whole new sets of vulnerabilities, new opportunities, and already it too is being slowed down by security concerns. A lot of what we hear about as big data, one of the big catchphrases right now in cybersecurity and in IT in general, is about information-rich markets and utilizing them better. So in all of these cases, we've got a landscape that's changing, problems that are changing, security issues that are arising, old ones that are fading away. And it's not being driven by the tail here that wants to wag the dog. It's being driven by that onward rush of the dog. So if we want to be relevant, not talking about stuff the dog has already gone by, if we want to talk about what's going to matter over the years to come, if we want to be dealing in any effective way with any of this, we really need to be talking about the big event here. We need to be talking about global business and where it's headed. Thank you.
Bob Dix.
Thank you. First, let me say thank you to Catherine and the planning team for putting this conference together. I actually, over the last night and today, have been somewhat encouraged by some of the honest dialogue that I have heard. Some tiptoe jobs, but by and large, a lot of honest dialogue. And I would argue that that's what we need in this country today around this topic and around the globe, is a true national, honest dialogue about this challenge. Remember, the bad guys aren't sitting around having meetings and discussions like this. They're about their business. So cybersecurity truly is a shared responsibility. Yet oftentimes, the rhetoric doesn't meet the reality. The President's Cyberspace Policy Review, released in May of 2009, reaffirmed the need for the public and private sector to work together to meet this national and economic security challenge. Yet today, even in discussions around this room at times, there are people in elected and appointed positions that would have you believe that businesses, including critical infrastructure owners and operators, are intentionally and maliciously ignoring risk and willfully putting their business viability and shareholder value, where appropriate, in jeopardy by failing to properly invest in the information systems and assets that they own. This has even extended to discussions that include the electric grid, water systems, pipelines, etc. Does any rational or even reasonably intelligent person really believe that? Why do we continue to seem to want to blame the victims and make our decisions based on hype and hysteria? We read sometimes the headlines about high-profile breaches. What we don't read about is the hundreds of thousands of exploit attempts that are repelled every day by those of us that are in this business, largely delivering a resilient capability each day. There's been a failure and a responsibility to share relevant threat information to inform the risk management decisions, oftentimes as a result of classification, antitrust, or other antiquated laws that inhibit the ability to actually collaborate on building situational awareness that would contribute to an ability to improve our detection, prevention, mitigation, and response, to issue timely, reliable, and actionable alerts and warnings, and even recommended protective measures. A lot of the discussion between last night and today has been around addressing that legal framework and identifying where the gaps are, excuse me, that we need to address. Yeah. That's a great step, and I think the answer to the question about where is that in the legislative initiatives that we're dealing with today was a very insightful answer. I would argue that in some cases that this discussion has even been turned into an ideological dialogue about the role of government. Some are advocating a new, burdensome, bureaucratic regime of regulation and compliance over the private sector critical infrastructure owners and operators as a means to address this. I would argue that by the time we put something like that together, it would be obsolete and it wouldn't do anything to make us safer or more secure. In fact, what we need to do is protect the ability of the private sector to continue to invest in research and development and the innovation that is delivering solutions into the marketplace that provide us hope of meeting this challenge. I would argue that the market is delivering innovation at an unprecedented pace in our history. But to build on some of the comments that Scott made, part of the challenge, not all of it, but part of the challenge is in technology adoption. We haven't sufficiently made a business case for people to understand why they need to invest. This gets back to the issue of sharing information and building situational awareness. We need to have an honest discussion about the economic inhibitors to greater adoption of technology solutions. In today's economic climate, if the decisions are around investing in inventory, investing in people, or investing in security, it's tough dialogue, tough discussion that people have to have. Additionally, we need to protect the ability of the private sector to be fast, nimble, and agile in responding to an ever-evolving and growing threat. Some of the discussion we've heard about working more closely with the ISPs, heck, I have a chance of working with many of the folks in that community every day, and there's an appetite there for being a part of the solution. It's oftentimes characterized as part of the problem, but there's some inhibitors that we need to have an honest dialogue about addressing in order to make that work better. How about a national education and awareness campaign that's comprehensive and sustained? Instead of a one-month effort, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, how about a sustained national education awareness campaign that helps home users and small businesses, some of the work that the FCC is already doing and that others are doing to build that sustained and comprehensive capability to help people understand better how to protect themselves. Many of us have been involved in trying to build a true joint integrated public-private operational capability around cyber, to improve upon that detection, prevention, mitigation, and response capability through enhanced situational awareness in times of steady state and times of escalation. A national weather service type capability with data feeds that provide us input in real time or near real time that give us a vision as to what's going on in the network community. When we tried to integrate by the way, the private sector conducted a pilot project and demonstrated an ability to share information across a number of critical infrastructure sectors. But when we tried to integrate that capability with our friends in the Department of Homeland Security, then all of a sudden, the lawyers came to the front and said, we can't do that. If part of you are involved and all of you are not, there's a competitive advantage, there's antitrust issues, there's other issues, and so we can't do it. This has to be addressed, ladies and gentlemen. Tactics like secret classified exercises intended to scare people and drive the hype is not contributing to the solution around this situation and this subject. Many arguments have been made since last night and today that the theft of intellectual property presents one of the most significant global national and economic security threats to our mere existence. We have to take this seriously and we have to work together to address it. The FBI, DoD, and others claim cybersecurity is potentially becoming one of the greatest risks to our national security. Why aren't we doing more to call out the perpetrators? It's easier to blame the victims than it is to call out the perpetrators. And I understand some of the challenges of that. But quite honestly, this is where we need to get to this with this dialogue. We hear a lot about supply chain risk management. Yet as we sit here today, one of the challenges remains that our colleagues in government, as a result of cultural issues driven by cost and schedule performance assessments, are buying from untrusted sources as we sit here today to save 5 cents on a widget. There are policy directions that we can implement around how we improve the ability to secure our supply chain, both in the public sector and in the commercial sector. Frankly, the question has to be asked, if the DoD and NSA and DHS are not able to prevent intrusions and theft of sensitive information, then why do government decision makers believe that industry is better equipped to do that on their own? I come back to where I started. This truly is a shared responsibility, and frankly, as we've also discussed over the last day and a half, we have examples that we can point to that when we work together, that we would put down the veil of the impediments and the reasons and the excuses, that when we actually identify risk, then when we share relevant information, that we come to the table with ingenuity and innovation that has been part of the basic fundamental foundation of this country since it was formed. We can and we must do more. our nation is counting on us to get it right. Thank you.
Rick Howard?
Bob, I'm depressed. Okay, man, oh man.
He was not trying to do.
Bob was talking about gloom and doom kind of stuff. I want to talk about a couple of things that the commercial sector is doing right now that is having some success. But before I do, I always want to get a sense of how technical the audience is. This is a pretty mixed crowd. So show of hands, how many people have at least one smartphone on their person right now? How many people have two? It can be any iPhone, Android. Well, you got two. Okay, how many have two in some sort of pad? Okay, 3. How many people have never written a letter by hand? Okay. This is probably over your head, ma'am. Okay, so, all right, so I deem you guys are technical enough to understand what I'm going to talk about. At iDefense, we have this notion of a cybersecurity disruptor, and there's a collection of these things. These are new technologies, new policies, new ideas coming down the pipe in the next 10 years that are going to fundamentally change how we protect the enterprise. And for the last 15 years, the way we've done it over and over again has been pretty much the same. The list of best practices have not changed that much. You got a firewall, you got an antivirus engine on the premise somewhere, you got an intrusion detection system, and some other stuff, but that's pretty much it. Okay, but in the last couple of years, we've seen a couple of innovations that I want to talk about. And the first one is this notion of a perimeter defense is a myth. Everybody in this room knows that is in the cybersecurity business, but what has changed in the last couple of years is that business leaders, commercial business leaders, are beginning to talk about it in public and recognize it. And what I want to talk about is you have to, with all the breaches that went on last year, I think at iDefense we tracked 700 breaches. That's just the stuff that was in the news. Okay, that's not the things that are going on that no one has known about. All right, that means you're pretty much going to get owned by somebody. All right, so that means the perimeter defense is not working, and we need to redefine what success here is with our perimeter defense. It's not whether or not you've been breached, okay, but it's whether or not that any damage was caused. Right? Have they got in? Have they taken your intellectual property, and have they gotten out? If you look at those 700 breaches we tracked last year, you will talk to each of those corporate leaders, and you will see that they were pretty satisfied with the way they handled the breach in their own environments. Okay, you were one, we were one. Okay, we were pretty happy the way we handled it. All right, so that's the notion, okay, that the perimeter is not sacrosanct, that you're going to get breached at some point. And that has caused some innovation about how my customers have watched their networks. The one thing that we have seen change this last couple of years is that they have accepted that their perimeter is going to get breached. But now what we're going to do now, if you make that assumption, you say that's going to happen, what can you do instead? Most of my customers now are watching traffic as it leaves their network. Okay, they are building automation platforms to watch Word documents leave to different places, watch PowerPoint documents go to different places, right? And as they see that happening, they can decide and discover patterns that shouldn't be there. Should Rick Howard be sending a Word document to some place in China? Okay, and if that's happening at 3 o'clock in the morning, okay, maybe that shouldn't be happening at all. Okay, and my customers are having huge success tracking that as the attacks are happening and shutting them down as they are happening. Okay, so we don't have to have a perfect record at the perimeter. We have to kind of back up, take a hit, and then watch what happens, okay, and see if we can shut it down in action. So that's number one. The second one that I've seen, and this is a new one, this has come up here in the last year. I was out at RSA a couple of weeks ago. I was a panel member to a pre-CISO conference. There's about 250 CISOs and CSOs and thought leaders that have been meeting at RSA for the last decade before RSA. And they did a poll of the audience, and they said, how many people have established their own intelligence programs? Okay, now what I mean by that, an intelligence program, I mean, this is not buying somebody like iDefense intelligence services. Okay, this is they've established their own intelligence program inside their organization that is separate from the IT guys and separate from the security guys. A group of folks whose job is to collect intelligence information from their own internal networks, from their signals capability, from all their hardware and software that's running on their networks, and collect sources from the outside in order to inform business leaders about how to protect their networks. This is a new thing, okay, and it's something that's very positive, I think. It's a new development in our arsenal. It's a new change to how we're going to do it. It's one of our cybersecurity disruptors. All right, so those are two things that I see positive for my commercial customers. All right, they've decided that the perimeter defense is not sacrosanct, and they are doing things about it, and they are building intelligence capabilities inside their organizations to help them defend better. So I find that as positive. That's all I got.
Rick. Rick, do you remember the stat on how many people did set up their own?
30%.
Okay.
30% of the 250 did. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Robert,
Okay, thank you very much.
do you have your slides? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you to Catherine for the invitation to speak. A little brief background. So British Telecommunications, who I work for, the major UK ISP. We're also a global network provider and a major sort of security services provider. That's a sales pitch over. I'll talk a little bit about something called Project Saturn, which hopefully you'll find interesting. But before we get to that point, I think the key issue is it was mentioned this morning, someone used the word ecosystem. Fundamentally, what we're dealing with is a complex adaptive system. That's what cybersecurity is. That's why it's a problem. It's continuously adaptive. Whatever defenses we take, the adversaries, the bad guys, are adapting and will always adapt. Yeah? There is incentive, so there's a response. And the whole thing is a complex adaptive system. Until we have that in our mindset, we tend to take a very much a linear, policy-driven or single technical approach to it, and this is why we fail. That's one dimension. A second dimension is, as was mentioned earlier by the panel, it's a big data problem. Yeah? I can tell you, so even just within our company, we're dealing with petabytes of data, of log data, of security data, of captured data. This is a lot of data. And you know, if you had a book of a petabyte, it'd take you about 1 million years to read it. Okay? You know, it wouldn't go well on your Kindle. Yeah? So it's a lot of data. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Only it's worse than that because it's not a needle, it's like a bent piece of straw in a haystack. It's a slightly perturbed piece of straw that's the malware, that's the problem. Yeah? So you can see that there is a real technical dilemma here for us to handle this. And of course you've got to do this in real time, at a low cost that meets the needs of your client. Can we have the next slide, please? So I manage a research program in our company, and this research program is trying to address some of these issues. We're trying to throw some smart techniques at the problem, how to address this complex adaptive systems issue, but specifically how to deal with this big data problem. And we've built various visualizations, various toolkits. It's a bit dull. I can tell you afterwards if you're really interested, if you're that much of a geek. But you get the idea. You can actually start to view the data. If you go to the next slide, please. It gets more interesting. So this is an example of data from one of our observed networks, if you like. And we can start to build tools that actually drill down into that data and give you an intelligent view of what's going on. One of the key aspects is there are various sort of intelligent algorithms underneath it that automatically process the data. The attacks are coming in real time, and the attacks themselves are automated. Yeah? And so in a typical attack time could be 10 to the minus 4 seconds, 10 to the minus 5 seconds. Yeah? I'm sorry, I'm bright, but I don't think in 10 to the minus 5 seconds. 10 to the 5 seconds I sometimes think in. But I'm not that fast. So we've got to automate the defenses. Yeah? Next slide, please. Apologies for the small font. This is kind of deliberate, so you can't see that. But this is an analysis of some of the log data from a particular network. This is real data, by the way. And what you're seeing here is sort of the tools we've got doing an automatic analysis, an automatic categorization of what's inside these, the malware inside this particular network. If that doesn't make sense, next slide will. Right. Okay. Okay.
Complete sense, yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully, even the policy people in the room can understand this. Sorry. Boo. Right, so you'll notice there's a certain asymmetry to the image. So basically the red nodes are servers that have got some kind of malware on. So we've sensed or detected in that particular client network there was some malware on that particular node, and the green nodes are the attacked nodes. And the lines connecting them are basically, this is over a sort of a few minute time period where you can see where the attack's coming from, where it's going to. Okay? Now I should say that these visualizations are real time, they're dynamic. When you have our analysts or a client analyst looking at this kind of view, they can drill down into it, they can filter it, they can interact with this in real time. But at least you can see what's going on. It's no longer just bits and bytes or IP addresses or very low-level information. Yeah? So you begin to get a much higher-level picture of what's taking place. Okay. Okay. Next slide. More detail. So you can drill down into that. If the next slide is more useful. Okay. So if you're interested, after the event, catch me. I run a workshop in London. There's one in the Royal Society this June. If you're interested, come along and speak to me. And that workshop is all about this issue of complex systems approaches to security. We also used to run that event down at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. I should say the US has a great resource there in the Santa Fe Institute that's done some interesting, very interdisciplinary work, sort of bringing biological metaphors, biological models, looking at the sociology, the psychology, the economic dimension of these kind of attack problems. So that there's some really good research going on in the US, probably much deeper and broader than we have in the UK at the moment. There's a personal blog and the corporate link at the top. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jamie?
Thanks, Eddie, and Catherine, thanks for putting me on this august panel. I'm glad Robert went right before me, so I'm not the only person on the panel that doesn't have an American accent. And Scott, I appreciate also being compared to a dog's tail. As a federal regulator, that's an anatomical step up for me. So. So as a representative, I work for Chairman Janikowski, and really what my talk is going to be about is what is a reasonable and helpful governmental role in securing an industry that basically is 90% plus owned by the private sector. And the FCC doesn't play a broad role here. We don't do cyber defense. We don't do cyber incident. But we are very interested and always have been in the security and the reliability of communications networks. And in the conversations that we had before this week and then last night, there's been a lot of discussion about a new legal framework for this. And I think that's absolutely, as Bob mentioned this, there's, I think, a great deal to be said about that. And even before that, though, I would say we have to have some new mental models about cybersecurity. Right now, we're pulled between different poles, and it's not just necessarily bipolar. You know, it's truly a dilemma in a lot of different ways. The internet must remain unfettered on the one hand, but we must secure the internet on the other. We want to protect privacy on one hand, but we really don't want anyone with the authority to protect privacy on the other. We want the internet to be an engine of continued economic growth, free of regulations. On the other hand, we can't sustain the loss of trillions of dollars over time from our economy. So we're pulled by all of these things. So as far as new mental models, and of course I'm a Navy guy, so I've got to have an analogy to the sea, but I do think of the sea as an analogy. In the 1300s and 1400s, the Spanish and the Portuguese, building on work that the Arabic culture did at the time, developed new navigational devices, the astrolabe, and in combination with the magnetic compass. In essence, it opened up commerce via the oceans. And the reason is that, sure, you could sail out, but you always wanted to be able to come back. And so that increased the reliability a great deal and opened up a global commons. And we still use the phrase today to talk about the wealth that it created. My ship has come in. It also opened up a brand new trade that became very profitable, piracy. It was a great deal, and it continued and flourished really until the nations developed capabilities and laws internally, and then working with other nations to combat this. Now, we still have piracy today, but it is not near I can't recommend it to you as a profession because it's just not that rewarding as it was at first. But the oceans are still an amazing commons, a source of commerce, and so perhaps as we look to mental models, we would have one that preserves openness and innovation, but we really shouldn't be afraid of guidelines, rules, conventions that provide sanity, protect privacy, property, and security. Now, in approaching this at the FCC, we really did think about the proper role of government. And we observed some key principles, and we would commend these to you. First, we want to ensure that the broadband economy remains the engine of innovation and growth, increasingly available to the public. Number two, and the chairman made reference to this, sacrificing privacy or internet openness for security is a false choice. We have to have all of that. We have to have openness, we have to have security, and we have to have privacy. Third, we really do believe that we must preserve the multi-stakeholder model to tackle Internet issues like cybersecurity. Stakeholders from across the ecosystem will need to work together on these problems and the problems that come in the future. Fourth, we should seek smart, practical, voluntary solutions through cooperative efforts to achieve cybersecurity wherever it is possible and effective. And then, I know this is an international audience, but within the United States, and I suppose within other countries as well, the federal partners must work closely together, really in a whole-of-government approach. We need to bring all of our talents to bear, and we really can't afford to leave anybody on the sideline on this or to pursue uncoordinated actions. And then lastly, we must have metrics that determine whether what we're doing is effective or not, something that may have been lacking in other efforts. So the next slide, please. So for the FCC, this began with the National Broadband Plan a couple of years ago. And one of the things that the National Broadband Plan called for was for the FCC to look at concrete threats that the FCC could do something about. This once again goes to the chairman's concept of not boiling the ocean. And we've also heard Frank Kramer and other people say this too. You have to scope this to things that can actually be achieved and we can make real progress on. So what we did is put together our Communications, Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. Let's see. Actually, I saw Andy Ojilski here. We have other people perhaps in the audience who actually worked on this. So these are just a representation of really some of the talent that we had. But the fact of the matter is there were 50 people that served on CISRIC and probably 100 people that worked on working groups below that. Experts in all kinds of fields, practitioners from carriers and ISPs, academicians, advocacy groups, all sorts of people coming together to work on these things. The chairman mentioned the three things that they were looking at. I'm going to only spend just a moment on those, but go into maybe perhaps just a little bit more detail. If we could go to the next slide. All of these projects are voluntary. All of them really, I think, come from the multi-stakeholder or industry-based. So I think it's a tremendous testimony to the industry that 90% have now signed up for it, and soon that 90% of the, and also 90% of them have signed up, 90% of the public will be covered once they're fully implemented. So in no particular order, on the DNSSEC, very, I guess, well developed. The problem is implementation and who goes first and how do we encourage that. And really what Steve Crocker and his group came up with was how do we advance this more quickly? What are the best practices for implementation? And I might say there's still work to be done. I mean, what they came up with is not full DNSSEC implementation. What they're in essence doing is the ISPs are making their DNS servers DNSSEC aware so that the user can actually validate the path, so to speak, and make sure that they're not being spoofed or tricked. On secure internet routing, here's an area where we're not as well developed. We're not ready for a complete full path validation. We can see it over the horizon. The standards still need to be developed. There's an expense to that part. Are there steps we can take now? And the answer basically that CISRIC came up was yes. There are what I would call incremental but significant steps. And so here's the first of many people stepping up to the plate. The American Registry of Internet Numbers stepped up and said, we will create the secure, authoritative database. The ISPs are saying, we will register our address blocks and keep them dynamically up to date. And then we will start checking our routes against that registry. And what we hope that will do is eliminate a great deal of the, I guess you'd say, mistaken routing, and it should make us more aware of the malicious routing that comes up. And then thirdly, the Anti-Bot Code of Conduct, ISPs, just to spending a little bit of time on this, obviously we looked at what is going on internationally in that. We took a lot of information from the Germans, from the Japanese, and then particularly from the Australian I-Code. And it follows in some ways. There's a lot of flexibility there. Basically, it is making the consumer aware, detecting that there's an infection, giving them options on ways to inform that. That's not easy. I mean, if you get an email from your ISP, do you read it? Do you think it's spam? Do you think they're trying to sell you something? Telephone calls get ignored. So, I mean, that's a big challenge, but this addresses some of those things. And then actually providing some tools for remediation. And then collaborating with one another to make sure that we learn as we go. So those are the three major things. We think that they're major step forwards, but the CISRC work actually doesn't stop there. The next work and the continuing work of this group is to look at barriers to implementation. I have to tell you on Working Group 7, they pretty much said, since everybody is signing up for this, that there may not be that much of any barriers, but they definitely want to get to something that I mentioned before and that is the metrics. How do we determine if these best practices, if this code are actually working? Because if it's not working, then we need to evolve, innovate, and do something more. And the question that we have to ask too is, what happens if it doesn't work? What are those things where there may be a role for government working with industry to come up with new solutions? And are there things that we have to do beyond that? And so I know that we don't like to talk about regulations. I don't think we may need regulations in this because there is innovation. But there may be a role in the future, and I wouldn't want to take that out as a possibility. For one thing, the possibility that's out there sometimes helps people come together to figure out voluntary solutions. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And I'll turn it back over to Eddie.
At this point, if anyone has any questions they want to tee up for the panel, please step up to the microphones. In the meantime, I want to tee up my own question as a starter. And again, please feel free to step up in the meantime. A number of you talked about the notion of success in various ways. Scott, you talked about economic growth, and Jamie talked about metrics, and Bob mentioned as well, his version of success. Rick, you talked about success as well, in the notion of security. And, all of you said, we need a better definition of success. Well, I mean, what is it? I mean, Rick, in your mind, what would be success from a commercial perspective, if you were to rethink security today? I mean, what would that look like in your mind?
That's a great question. I guess I shouldn't have thrown it out there if I didn't think you're going to throw it back at me, all right? So, no, I've been thinking about this for the last couple of months, right? Especially in terms of the breach stuff. If you talk to any corporate leader and you talk about, gee, what is our process for handling breach notifications? They freak out, all right? The marketing people, the core comm guys freak out. We don't want to tell anybody anything, because that may bring shame and our reputation may go down and all that stuff, right? But if you look at how many people have been publicly breached, right, and then add on to that all the others that we don't know anything about, there's probably no shame in it anymore, all right? So if we just can accept that, then maybe the definition of success is what damage was done to us, okay? Has our stock price gone down? Have we lost intellectual property? Has anybody been hurt in it, in terms of your personnel, because of some sort of personal information being leaked? I think those are kinds of things we need to kind of get our hands around.
Should organizations be compelled to disclose breaches?
Wow, I'm not supposed to even talk about stuff like that.
All right, whatever. Scott, I mean, you talked about success in terms of economic growth, but you said, well, technology is running faster than security. So what do we do to be successful, as security people, if we're going to keep up with all that? I mean, we seem to be a constraint here.
So all of this is ongoing. This is, and we can track it in an ongoing way. We can actually calculate risk, believe it or not, and we can estimate. We can actually come up with rough annualized expected loss numbers. We can look at the value created by new information systems, and we can make sure we're just constantly creating a lot more value than we're losing. Cybersecurity is now part of life all the time, everywhere.
Well, it's a risk equation then, right? So does it matter that bad guys come down and compromised the janitor's laptop? Okay, does that matter compared to maybe pulling out VeriSign's intellectual property? So that risk assessment has to be made.
It's essential to always talk about the threats and the frequency or how soon they're going to occur. It's essential to always talk about the effect, the consequences, the effect on the value that we're creating. And by the way, if somebody's talking about protecting valued assets, we always know they're protecting the wrong things. You don't care what an asset costs, what it would cost to buy or create. You care about how much value you're creating with that asset over time and how much less value you would create with a cyber attack. And we can quantify vulnerabilities as the degree to which we're vulnerable to that consequence. We can actually make sense out of this.
So there's basic blocking and tackling elements here that I think factor into success in adding tools to the toolbox. The legal framework, how many times have we heard that, right? But why aren't we doing it? I asked that question before and really didn't get a good answer about that. That's a dialogue that ought to be taking place. Secondly, creating a operational capability so we have visibility and situational awareness into what's going on in the network during steady state and during times of escalation. That's a capability that I would bet most American people think we have today, and we don't.
Is that something that companies should, like individual organizations should do, or is that, like, who should do that?
No, I think that's got to be a public-private activity that engages the Department of Homeland Security, the backside folks that have the threat intelligence, the ICCCE and other operational entities in the critical infrastructure community, other sources of data that can inform that process, a nerve center, a National Weather Service style capability that gives us visibility so that we can move towards a model of detection, prevention, and mitigation instead of today where we spend so much of our time, energy, and resource in response and recovery. A sustained national education awareness campaign that addresses, I mean, there are some people in this room that have the empirical data, but it is estimated that 80% of the exploitable vulnerabilities are a result of no or poor cyber hygiene. Hygiene, basic fundamental low cost or no cost things that people, small businesses, and even larger enterprises can be doing to protect themselves. So there are basic elements of blocking and tackling that we could be doing tomorrow. How about there's organizations like the National Cybersecurity Alliance and other nonprofits. How about if every member of Congress and every company and all of us in this together had a link on our homepage that directed people to information about how they could better protect themselves? What are those best practices? What are the tips that Jamie and his team have developed for small business? How do people get access to that to help raise this bar? 80% is a big number. So even if we got half, we make it more expensive and more difficult for the bad guys to get access into the networks that they use to then do their thing. So there's basic blocking and tackling, Eddie, that I think we should be focusing our attention on, especially together in our shared responsibility.
Yeah, those are good success factors. Robert?
Yeah, okay, are we on? So on that point of a weather map, this is a great idea. So in the UK, as of last year, our Prime Minister initiated a program called the Cyber Hub, which is exactly this, to try and bring together the public and private sector to create an intelligent, real-time, open information feed that tells you what's going on across the state. But we've got to hit all these points of building trust between the public and private sector, between the private sector entities that are competing. And the bottom line there is trust. So it's the UK government's trying to go down, act as a facilitator to build that trust and to link the people together.
I would like to differ there. I don't think the bottom line is trust. We did a little analysis of when private-public partnership and forums and so on are working. And they work and have active participation when they are delivering more value than the costs of participating. You can actually figure out what people from private sector are getting as their return from participating, and you can figure out how much time and trouble and cost, in other words, it's taking to participate. When the balance when they're gaining more than it's costing them, they participate very actively. The operation thrives. And some of the ICCCEs are good examples of that. When it's not working that way, when it's costing them more than the return, they stop participating. It's simple economics.
I actually think it's both. I think it's both trust and return, because I wouldn't value information from an unknown source, so I have to trust the source. but I also think it has to have
Which
intrinsic value.
And I'd translate the trust into estimate of your risk and your cost.
There's two things there too. One is that the commercial organizations want government intelligence, all right? But they're not going to wait around forever to get that done. So they're already starting to form their own groups. I mean, the ICCE are one way to do that, but there are other ways of combining across sector that people are starting to think about. So they're going to share that information. It's going to happen whether with the government or with not.
That's right.
Building on those successes, I mean, Gavin and I, our two companies, we compete vigorously in the marketplace, but we work in an organization called ICCCE with a number of our other global partners in security incident response, where we look at multi-vendor, multinational vulnerabilities, and we work together in real time to try and address those because it's in the common interest of our companies and our global community. That's a perfect example, and that's private sector driven. Private sector driven.
Eddie, I would say, just one other thing on the success factor like that. We don't have, this conference is not addressed, I don't think, spam or junk facts or things like that. So I mean, one factor of success, if Catherine has this in future years and we're not talking about botnets, we're not talking about these things, then some of the things we're talking about here have in fact been successful. Those things were basically done by the multi-stakeholder group getting together, coming up with industry solutions, and spam hasn't gone away, but it's just not a factor for conferences anymore. So
That's true. It's a good point. Okay, we have a question in the audience, please.
Yeah, sure. Eli Jellens, VeriSign. Rick has not seeded this question through me, I promise. So in terms of taking another step off of what could potentially constitute success, we've talked a lot about like regulation, legislation, purely defensive measures. On the other hand, Rick's point about different organizations developing their own intelligence capabilities, that's going a little bit beyond defense. I mean, part of it's preemptive. A lot of it is doing better at understanding who's behind this. We've talked about a lot of responsibilities for those being attacked, but what would success look like in terms of coordination, public-private or private-private, towards more aggressive identification of the attackers? We have the example of the Rostock takedowns, the core flood takedowns, a lot of which was industry-led or facilitated. What more can we do in that regard?
That's a good point. Comments?
I love that story. Okay, what Microsoft is doing with that operation is fantastic. The only thing they could do better is to do more, right? And the only way, and they're doing it all pro bono, all right. So what they really need is other folks to join in with those folks to help do that. I mean, they're taking down how many botnets a year, 3 or 4? Well, and there's 15,000 of them though, so we need to ramp that up to about 1,000 botnets a month in order to get anything done. And maybe groups like this can get that kind of stuff going, all right? I love what Microsoft is doing, but we need to throw a lot more resources that
Isn't it fair to say, Rick, they're not doing that by themselves?
No, they're not doing it by themselves.
There's a collaborative effort there that's bringing law enforcement into that discussion along with the private sector entity. And as you and I know, because we worked on a project together, one of the things that sometimes we make the mistake is that folks in government, especially in the intelligence community and law enforcement community, think that those of us in industry are interested in sources and methods. We don't care about that.
Right.
We're interested in tactics, techniques, and procedures that can help us inform risk management decisions. That's very valuable information because similarly in the physical space, you cannot protect everything all the time. Same is true in cyber, okay? So having the information helps us inform the risk management decisions. And as you know, when we actually have the ability to collaborate, analyze, correlate that data, we can make good decisions. We can issue alerts and warnings. We can even recommend protective measures when we have the ability to do that together.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues. One is that we're not putting the attack or the attacker at the center of the problem, right now. So if you look at some of these grand issues in this space, I mean, one of them is, for example, how do we get groups of, whether it's private companies or individuals focused on botnets, and then how do we contribute the right data to them? Because it is going to be privileged government data at times, it's going to be law enforcement data, but it's also going to be companies like iDefense. It's going to be, for example, what we do at EMC. We have, we're one of the 30%, just like you are, being able to provide our own very unique threat intelligence that we generate And there are lots of other companies that are very successful at doing that. But if you take that and you give it to pockets of individuals that are focused on, for example, botnet takedowns or nation-state attribution or other types of tasks, they can make that useful. It's only going to be useful, though, if it's timely, it's detailed, it's shared in a secure manner, it's trustworthy. You know, I mean, there's different things that have to happen that are very, very difficult today. I mean, to your point, you know, we've created some interesting commercial collaborative frameworks that have been very, very successful in this space. But we need all of these elements to come together, and then we need people focused on these various challenges that are out there.
So here's another answer to your question of what is success. If you want to understand your attackers, you need to look at who's out there, how they can gain, what capabilities would be necessary for them to carry out the attacks that would produce those gains, and what those capabilities cost. When we improve our defenses, we're upping the costs for the attackers. If we can up the costs for the attackers beyond what they gain, that's success.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yes, John Muir from Security Innovation Network. Two related problems. One is both government and commerce are dependent upon advanced security solutions, which largely come from small companies. Small companies are having enormous trouble getting venture capital because of all the changes in the economic scene. And at the same time, and that means it's harder for them to get going on solutions to problems that are coming up. So there's a big lag between the time a problem is noted and somebody builds a company and gets the technology there. The other related problem is that the universities who do a lot of research, by and large, have great difficulty commercializing or getting whatever research they've done out in a way that can be used by the public sector. So I'd like some comments about how we address those problems, because there seems to be a real problem in the transition from innovation to implementation and how we fund that.
I guess I don't necessarily agree with that statement entirely, in the sense that bring some of it our way. We, you know, in our company, we work with a number of universities. We have both, you know, what I would call open source types of initiatives with a number of universities that we're funding. We have private research that we're doing with universities designed to bring innovations to market. You know, we are very interested in early stage companies. We're very interested in all kinds of, you know, the entire continuum. And I know that others in this room, you know, have the same trajectory in terms of things that they're doing. I'm also involved with a group that's having a workshop in 2 weeks here in DC called the Cybersecurity Research Institute. It's a bunch of different companies that are looking at the nexus among private companies, the government's research agenda, and university agenda, and you know, we're inviting others to participate in it. I know you've heard about it. I mean, but you know, so I think that, you know, there probably are gaps that still need to be addressed, but I would argue that there are outlets also. If the technology is interesting enough, give me a call. I mean, I don't know.
You know, John.
Go ahead, sir.
So not speaking for the FCC, this is just Jamie Barnett, governmental guy,
Part-time
talking.
PC.
Hacker extraordinaire. You know, one of the things I would be interested in is something that, in essence, generates more incentives for those types of companies. We're very interested to read this week about, you know, basically rapid acquisition by the government, those types of things to incentivize it. The other thing is, I'm not recommending there be any regulation in this area. On the other hand, there may be things where government can create, I guess, markets. So, for instance, we all take 911 for granted. It's been around since 1968. But the fact of the matter is that all came about as a FCC regulation where you said, okay, telecommunications company, we'd like for you to offer that. Now, that doesn't mean that any government has to do that. And there are actually some counties in the United States that still don't have 911. But it created something that wouldn't have existed otherwise, the 911 industry. And the carriers like that. Somebody has to pay for security. ultimately has to get paid on. What's the best way to incentivize those innovative companies to provide that security? So incentives and creation of markets, I think, are the main things.
Tell you, for strategic stuff, I don't have an answer for university information, but for tactical stuff, we've had so much success bringing smart interns in from really good colleges and throw them at a problem I don't even know how to tell them about. I said, go solve this thing, and 4 months later they've solved it and now they're working for us, right? So that part works very well. Excuse me.
You're kind of choked up about
I am, man. I'm really emotional about it.
Those guys are great, man.
It was a really big, yes, sir.
Hi, Andrew Cushman from Microsoft. I've got 2 questions, and one's easy and one's harder, and I'll let you decide. So what's the private sector, what's the industry role in the state-on-state norms discussion? What should that be? Should there be any role there? And secondly, when do you think that private industry, or if, is going to get into the active defense game? I mean, they're into the
So
intel
which question
game.
was
Yeah,
which?
they're both hard.
Which was which?
Well, I thought Rick might have an easy answer to the active defense. You know, that's an easy follow-on next year at RSA.
I'll let someone else go first.
Maybe you should answer your own question.
I'll take the state one. That's easy. It's not our problem. Gas government. That leaves the hard one for the rest.
Well, I do think that there, given that much of the infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and I do think that there is a role for industry to play in that dialogue.
Well, could you define active defense? I mean, are you
No,
referring...
I'm sorry. Active defense, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, okay.
You know, there's the Computer Abuse and Fraud Act. That applies to individuals as well as to companies.
I mean, and if active defense are initiatives like, for example, botnet takedowns or, other things like that.
Actually, Eddie, on that point, this raises a sort of research question, which is that something we've been interested in is the whole idea of immune systems. So all of our bodies have an active defense capability. We call it an immune system. And I think ultimately, the internet is going to have something like an immune system within it, in terms of very active, hyper-adaptive, self-organizing, defensive capability. Because without it, it won't function, not in anything like the way we want. I mean, every person in this room now is carrying pathogens. You all have viruses in you, but your body is coping. Your body's coping with that. So apart from him, he's dying, but...
In cyber, releasing the antibodies is illegal. If you design a piece of a tool that will go out there and eat the malware, it is considered an attack on malware, and you will be prosecuted.
I didn't say it was
Some
easy.
places, yeah.
But I do think that I do think it's interesting to think about perhaps a redefinition of active defense or a broadening of that definition. That if you were to describe creating terrain in cyberspace as a helpful defense, I think that that's easy to get. It's a hard problem, but it's easy to get some focus on that, perhaps.
Are you suggesting, like, I've had this idea for a long time too, that the internet should be open and free and anonymous and all that for just, general surfing, but if you want to do some sort of transaction, some sort of financial transaction, some sort of government transaction, that there should be some more rigor to who you are and all that kind of thing. Is that what you're talking about?
That wasn't necessarily but if you think about terrain in a military perspective, choke points or that would be helpful to think about how do you go and create that in what normally is considered a flat cyberspace.
But then you're getting into the whole walled garden,
Right.
iTunes dimension,
It's really tough.
which is its own issues.
And would you apply it to, I like asking him questions rather than him asking us questions. Would you apply that concept to critical infrastructures then?
The concept of building terrain?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and that might actually be the first place where you go and deploy that.
I will say, though, that I've been saying this for a number of years, though, when you do the active defense thing, and even if you're doing choke points and things, you do something actively, the enemy gets a vote, right? So if you do something that don't think that's going to, oh, he's going to say, oh, well, gee, they did something, I'm done. Okay, so that's not going to happen. That means they're going to reinvigorate their efforts to come after you. And the case study for that is what happened to H.B. Gary this year, or last year.
True.
All right, so they poked the beehive, and a whole government business goes under because of that. All right, so you got to be careful of that.
So, and then I'll just go ahead and continue the answer to industry in the norms discussion, the state-on-state norms discussion. I do think that there's this notion of shared functional necessity. That's where the agreement is going to be, the functional necessity to avoid something. And I think that industry has a voice there to help articulate that, perhaps. That might not be, that industry has a perspective to contribute that might help in rounding that out or in fleshing out that functional necessity.
I think that's happening now. I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I need your intellectual property, you give it to me. Right?
I think it's happening now. I mean, at iDefense, we're tracking 18 different cyber espionage sets, all right? And talking to different research groups, that number goes up or goes down depending on what it is, but we all have a sense of what the bad guys are doing. And what we have not done is gone to the let's give it away to everybody for free kind of a thing yet. Okay.
Unfortunately, a lot of companies are doing that, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Mark.
And no, Eddie, I'm not going to embarrass you. We're amongst friends, right? And if I was on your panel, I'd have to answer my own questions, so you guys get to answer. Since the military was, Mark Sox, Verizon, since the military was just brought up as an analogy, one of the things we understand in the intelligence versus operations world is intelligence usually supports operations, not the other way around. The conversation we're having here in Washington is one of the government wanting the private sectors to support the government versus the government supporting the private sector. I'm wondering if you could noodle that a little bit there, is shouldn't the private sector be the supported group versus the supporting group? In other words, most of the information flow should come from the government to the private sector because we do own and operate the vast majority of all this stuff, versus the expectation of it going the other direction. Love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, Mark, from my standpoint, the FCC, and as I kind of alluded to in my talk, the front line of defense and the telecommunications and the folks, the ISPs, folks who operate the internet, will always be in private hands. And so the FCC's view has always been, how do we organize that? So if we can do things like CISRIC, voluntary folks coming together, collaborating, bringing the good ideas forward, that's great. In other areas where, there's, for some reason, the market doesn't supply the thing, maybe regulation does that, but it's always, for our friend, for the telecommunications industry, you guys are the front line. It's not the government's going to do it. So I don't know if that applies, completely across the government, but I would say that was the FCC's view.
The answer I think there's a compromise there. Okay, I don't know where you went. There you are. Okay, I don't think it's situation dependent. So commercial is going to be the operator in some cases, government's going to be the facilitator, and it goes vice versa. And we haven't come to that agreement yet, but I think that's where it's going to end up.
Although I think that the premise you offer is correct, because the missing element today is that threat intelligence to help inform the risk management decision-making process. And quite honestly, one of the things that we ask, and even when we do these exercises, in terms of the role of the government when we have an incident of national or global consequence, is stay out of the way. Let us do our jobs. Let us manage the network capabilities and deliver the resilience that we deliver every single day that people rely on and oftentimes take for granted. If we had access to that threat intelligence information to help inform that, we would even be better at that risk management process and informing the decision-making that goes into those risk management decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, the government severely overclassifies the information that once it's provided to you, you sort of go, are you kidding me? A lot of that should be provided in a close to real-time manner and shouldn't be classified to the degree it is. It's ridiculously classified.
The emphasis in private sector is always on getting the right answer and acting as quickly as possible. The emphasis in the government is on following the correct procedure. Those can work, one of those is superior in some contexts, the other in other contexts. it's necessary to think about how those two sides function and whether it's appropriate. Most of the time in cyber, if you want the right answer and quick action, you don't want to be worried too much about following all the right procedures.
There's also assumption the government has the really cool data, okay? And they don't. They don't have that corner of the market.
No.
We go back to commercial organizations forming their own intelligence outfits. I got one financial institution whose intelligence group is so good that if they went commercial, they would compete with us directly.
Absolutely.
Right? So it isn't that we don't need the government to give us that data. It'd be nice if they did.
It's worse than that. Secrecy covers an enormous amount of ignorance.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Eric Berger from Georgetown. And no, Bob, I'm not going to talk about securing everything end-to-end, which we should do. I'm actually, we've heard a lot about the government and what the government should or shouldn't do. We've heard a lot about industry and what industry should or shouldn't do. And I'm actually looking at, what about that third pillar, civil society, the users? What do you see, sort of the relation of what industry can do in a sense to support users? For example, if you look at the botnet work, some could say, well, that's actually deep packet inspection. You're doing a wiretap on what I'm doing. And by the way, it's not really a botnet. I've just invented the next peer-to-peer network. Or no, really, Aunt Mabel's computer really has been compromised. She has no clue. How do we turn it off? Oh, we've turned it off. Are we censoring? Are we, shutting off the internet for her? And, is this something that industry can address? And if so, love to hear your thoughts on how.
Sometimes I do an address on that topic, and my comparison is it's basically the end user is kind of like Homer Simpson. They really are clueless. I spend half my time educating people who have PhDs in basic hygiene, computer hygiene. So it's not that, forget about addressing the man in the street. Even people with high levels of education, even technical education, are still unaware of basic computer procedures that you need to defend yourself. And so we go back to the issue of, as you say, as vendors, what can we do to help protect people without intruding on their privacy or taking away anything from them? And in the UK, often the dialogue is then, can we do that and at the same time not be anti-competitive? So for example, we give away an antivirus package with our broadband to most of our users, half of whom don't install it. It's free. They're getting it completely for free. It just comes with it. Please just click and install. I don't know whether they're afraid of us, doing something else. But so there's an educational process, but also then it goes back to policy. What does the law allow you to do that's not anti-competitive, but at the same time is actually designed to help people? So.
But it's not all doom and gloom either. I mean, when I get that question, the first thing I tell them to do is upgrade your operating system, okay? Because it's better, okay? The browsers are better, okay? So go there first, and if you do that, you're better than most people that are out there, okay? So industry has that responsibility. Microsoft's done a great job. The Linux platform's done a great job, okay, to make the thing more secure, okay? So, do that. And that's our responsibility.
So I'd like to thank you. I had a bet with Robert that he couldn't work Homer Simpson into this discussion. So I used to be the director of naval education. I'm a big proponent of education, but I will have to say this is one area where education is good, but it won't get us all the way. And ultimately, I think what we're seeing, and we're starting to hear it from some of the ISPs, is there is, in addition to the things that have driven internet use in the past, which is basically speed and cost, we're now seeing a market for security. And so I think ultimately that's going to be, people are going to be more, my information, my banking, my purchases, pictures of my babies are at risk, and I want somebody to protect that, and I'm willing to pay some amount per month to do that. And so the degree that the security gets built in, and I know there are folks probably in the audience who have those innovations now and on the way, and I think ultimately the gap between what education will provide, innovation will make up the difference, where it's kind of built in the way that safety procedures and devices are built into my car.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thanks. Randy Fort with Raytheon. I'd like to push back on the panel's my perception of your dismissiveness of this idea of active defense. You kind of blithely, it would violate the computer fraud. And so a bank somebody walks in and tries to steal the property of a bank, the bank is allowed to use lethal force to stop their property from being taken or lives being threatened. And it's not just banks. There are lots of companies which, when a perimeter is breached, lethal force can be used. You can track the person down and shoot them to death for what they've done. So, the principle is there, number one. Number two, there may be this particular piece of legislation you're concerned about, but there's something called the Constitution, and in there, the government has something called letters of marque and reprisal. So the U.S. government could actually authorize a company to conduct active defense and go out and do virtual lethal force on someone who was conducting those sorts of things. So is there a market there for that sort of thing? Is this where it's going? If the government does not provide a response to companies whose billions of dollars of property are going out the window, as we've heard today, are left with trying to take action themselves. So I just want to push back a little bit and see if there's more to that than you were originally willing to accept. Thanks.
So I don't think any of us were dismissing active defense. I think we're all pretty much supporters of active defense. What we were bringing up was some of the obstacles that need to be overcome before we can implement that, and one of them is one of the ones you just identified. If we had a government agency that was empowered to carry out certain kinds of active defense measures, I think most of us would support that. Actually figuring out what the rules for that would be and how you would do it is very, very tricky.
That's the trick.
Yeah, or if they said that, we could just shoot anybody in any country we wanted and there would be no reprisals, I mean, that would be okay too.
Yeah, but since I used an oceanic and piratical analogy, I love your concept of letters of marque, and we could have these privateers out there. But I don't push back with the idea of active defense at all. I mean, but the rules are, that's the top.
There's a lot in between.
Other complications, when Estonia was being attacked by massive denial of service, a very large portion of the computers attacking Estonia were in the United States. If Estonia had been employing active defense, they would have been zapping huge numbers of American computers. It's a tricky issue.
So, but I think not a government role, an international role. My fantasy wish list has an international botnet task force called the Terminators. Okay, all right, and their job, and they have legal authority to pursue the bad guys through whatever country is signed up for it. All right, to their place of origin. That's my Christmas fantasy.
I like that one. So with that, we're going to conclude this panel.